Now I know what you're thinking. Yes, I am slowly evolving into Father Brian and Father Sean. I'm now carrying things around in my homilies. But that is because I have to quote something today, and it's a complicated quote, and I didn't want to mess it up and say heresy to you all by saying something that was not right. What I really love about the church is that in its infinite wisdom, the readings always seem to be pertinent to the day that we're at, the time that we're at in our life. Even though the readings have been set that it's going to be the same readings on every 29th Sunday in ordinary time, and the cycle B, it's going to be these readings, there's something unique that it always seems to happen with the readings for the day that pertain to us. And today's readings are no exception to that. Now, Archbishop has asked, and it also very much connects to the readings that we preached this weekend on politics. Take a deep breath. I felt the tension in the room rise. I felt everybody's blood pressure spike. It is okay. We'll get through it together, all right? But the readings today specifically do connect to politics in a certain way, and I'll explain why here in a sec. But in order to understand politics and understand anything in that, we need to understand, first, what is the virtue of justice? Now, virtue of justice is one of the cardinal virtues, but it's one that most people just kind of ignore, right? Everyone knows, temperance means I can't get drunk on the weekends. Prudence means I make the good decisions. Fortitude means that maybe I'll die, but that's about it. What does justice actually mean? Justice is giving over or giving back to God and to those around you, your community, what is due to them. We can misconstrue this, right, in our understanding of justice, thinking that it's just a correcting of somebody who's wrong, right? Somebody gets what they deserve. But this is an incorrect understanding of justice. Ultimately, it's paying back and giving back to God and to those around us what is due to them. And so, we have to look, why does it matter that we think about the people around us? It's because when God created us, He didn't create us to just be solitary creatures, right? Or else we'd all be living in some huts in the middle of nowhere by ourselves. But rather, because of the way He created us, we are destined for community, to live with each other. And from that flows some natural consequences. That ultimately, we no longer can just think and worry about ourselves, but we actually have more people that we have to think about and care for than just ourselves. And we could think that this is an encroachment on our freedom, but that's an entirely wrong understanding of what it means to be free. Freedom, ultimately, let's get ready for the quote. Human freedom is not fulfilled by subordinating truth to itself, but by subordinating itself to truth. Now, I didn't make that up. That was John Paul II, so if you have a problem with that, take it up with him. But let's look at this quote. Human freedom does not lose something when it subordinates itself to truth, but rather it gains something. Meaning that our freedom, our understanding of freedom, and the way that we interact with those around us ultimately has to come under truth. And if we try to put our freedom above truth and say that our freedom is what actually informs truth, everything falls apart. This is so contrary to the world. And ultimately, this is the root, though, of everything that we do with politics. By the fact that we are created by God for community, and we are recalled to live out justice, the virtue of justice, and in doing so we are practicing our human freedom to the fullest, it means that we have an obligation to participate in politics. Now we can take this to the extremes, right? You have the people that think that their political party is their entire identity, and they think that that's the first question God's going to ask them when they get to heaven, whether they were Republican or Democrat. It's not. But we have the far other extreme, where we sit there and we say, oh, politics is so complicated, everything's falling apart in the world, I'm just not going to do jack squat with it, and I'm just going to let everybody figure it out and fizzle it out, and they can all, just fight amongst each other. Both of these are wrong. We, by the fact that we are created by God, have an obligation to participate in politics. Now, thank goodness, and it's good for all of you, I can never become the president of the United States because that's a part of canon law, and I would make a terrible president for you all, probably. I don't know anything about politics when it comes to that stuff. But ultimately, all of us live in a world where politics is a common part of our life. So much so that we have an election coming up. We have 3 major issues on our ballot that are coming up that I've been asked to speak with you about. Now, I'm not just making these up and bringing these up because I want to just throw politics into a homily. But actually, and it's, like I said in the beginning, the amazingness of the church, actually, all 3 of these amendments connect to one of the readings today. And we can look at them in light of the readings, because we have an obligation to know. Right? People can often say, well, I just didn't know that was wrong. I didn't know that this was not the case or whatever, so I'm not culpable for this. That's wrong. You had the ability to know, right? If you spent your entire life thinking that murder was okay, and you're like, oh, I thought murder was fine, and you get to heaven, God's like, no, you had plenty of opportunities to know that murder was wrong. Not only was it written on your heart from the beginning of time, but also it's in the laws, it's in the way that everybody else in the world is living. You realize none of them are murdering people, etc. So we have an obligation to be aware and know of what's going on in our world and be informed by that, ultimately taking part in politics. And so we jump into today's first reading. Isaiah. Isaiah is talking about the Messiah. He is explaining that the Messiah is ultimately going to come and he's going to suffer and die for our sins. They don't understand this at the time, but ultimately that's what he's saying. And what's confusing to them is that throughout all of history, the only God at the time who had never, ever, 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 ever asked for human sacrifice was the God of the Israelites. So how could the Messiah offer himself as a sacrifice on our behalf if he was just merely this human being? Right, because by the fact that we remember our Genesis, that we are created in the image and likeness of God, certain things flow from that, and that we all have dignity. And God has never once asked for us to murder people. He's never going to ask for us to murder people. And ultimately, every single one of us is created with an inherent dignity. And God, on our behalf, offers himself for our sins. He doesn't ask us to kill anybody. He offers himself for our behalf. And so we jump into the first of these amendments. Amendment 79, the right to abortion. If that name of it didn't throw you off already, the answer is no. Amendment 79 creates a constitutional right to unrestricted abortion and allows for taxpayer-funded abortions to by repealing the constitutional ban on public funding. It'll do 3 things, all right? It will ban parental notice being required for a child to get an abortion. It allows abortion all the way through 9 months of pregnancy, and it will force taxpayers to pay for the abortions in their state taxes. Now, in light of the first reading, does that sound like something that God was asking us to do? No. But suddenly, because it's a human being that's in the womb, it's okay for us to murder them. It's not. If a serial killer was going around murdering everybody, we would have an obligation to say, stop killing people, you have consequences for your actions. But the minute we say that with people who are committing abortions or in the government, suddenly we're the enemy. There's no logic there. Ultimately, each and every person, from the moment of conception to natural death, has an inherent dignity, the dignity of the human person. And by that means that we were created in the image and likeness of God, and therefore God is never going to, never has, and never will ask us to murder them. And we as Catholics cannot support abortion. Does not matter at any state, at any exception at all. Abortion is always, 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 always wrong. Now, there's a lot that we could be saying on this, but we have 2 other readings to get to. Ultimately, abortion goes against how we were created. It is anti-human. And so, we move on to the second reading. The second reading is from Hebrews. Now, this one's a little bit more complicated. The book of Hebrews is written by somebody who is trying to address the problem that the Hebrew people are struggling to reconcile both of their old Hebrew, the Jewish faith, and their new Christianity together, and they don't know how to do so. And the author of Hebrews is writing and saying, you do so through Jesus. Jesus is the one that bridges that gap. And ultimately, Jesus is the one that informs us, teaches us, and shows us exactly what it means to live a life in union with God. And so, we look to our second amendment. The Amendment 80, right to school choice. Amendment 80 creates a constitutional right to school choice for every K through 12 child and a right for parents to direct the education of their children. School choice allows parents to choose the schooling option that best fits their children's learning needs. This gives all children the opportunity to have a great education regardless of their income level or their zip code. Ultimately, we want you to vote yes on this. Because we understand that who we are as people requires Christ at the center of it. Christ is the center teacher and the center light that guides us to the truth, because he is truth. And ultimately, if we ban from allowing any kind of religion into our education, we are ultimately building our houses on this sandy ground. It's going to crash and burn, hence the world. We believe that Jesus is at the center of everything, and so Jesus has to be the center of our education. Education of all people, but in particular way of kids. And so, we require and the need of ability to choose our schooling. Choose what our kids actually are learning, because we need that learning to be centered on Christ. Because if we don't, it doesn't matter anymore. Ultimately, nothing matters without Christ. He is at the center of all. And so therefore, he has to be at the center of our teaching, the center of our education, and ultimately the center of the upbringing of our children. And if we can't do that anymore, life is going to be a lot more difficult. And so we move to the gospel. We have James and John, the sons of thunder. They're called that, in my opinion, because they're a little sparky and they say stupid things sometimes. They're the ones that decided, Lord, should we call down fire and burn these people? And he says, no, what are you talking about? Today they ask an equally strange question of Jesus, can we sit at your right and at your left? Now their understanding of the Messiah is that he's going to be a king and a ruler in this world. And so their understanding is, I want to be a part of your kingdom and you ruling in this earthly reality. And Jesus says, no, that's not how things work. Not only is that not for me to give, but ultimately the way that looks like and what that looks like lived out is through my passion, death, and resurrection. And ultimately you sacrificing yourself for others as well too. And so he ends up telling them this line that we hear all the time. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. This brings us to our final amendment, which of all of them has the dumbest name, protecting the freedom to marry. Amendment J will remove the constitutional definition of marriage as a union of one man and one woman. Marriage is based on the truth that men and women are complementary, the biological fact that reproduction demands on a man and a woman, and the social science that supports the fact that children need both a mother and a father to flourish. Amendment J rejects this truth as to what marriage is. Ultimately, the answer is no. Don't. The central unit of our society is the family. And the way a family is lived out is a husband and a wife fully serving and giving of themselves to each other in such a concrete way that that love becomes a human being. That's what's the center of society. And when we change that definition of what marriage is, we ultimately remove that ability, and therefore the central unit of society falls apart and we have nothing. Because marriage has to be that life-giving sacrifice. The entirety of oneself to another in such a concrete way, just like Jesus did for the church. We have to serve, not be served. And when we remove that definition of marriage, it no longer leads us down to that way. It just becomes, I am here to use and be used. And that is so chilling, honestly. Marriage has to be between a man and a woman. Not only for the good of the child, not only for the good of society, but by the nature of who we are as created by God and adopted children of God. And if we support things that are opposed to these, we are ultimately confusing and leading other people to confusion. We could sit there and say, and people say all the time, oh, well, it's not my thought that I think abortion's wrong, but it's not, who am I to tell somebody else that? Baloney. Because by your action, you're showing them that what they're doing is good. And therefore, you're leading them astray, and you're just as culpable for that as they are. We, as Catholics, have an obligation. As human beings created by God, we have an obligation to be a part of a community and be a part of society. And part of that obligation, through our freedom that we have, is practicing this virtue of justice. Giving back to the community and to God what actually is their due. Saying, Lord, this is the life. This is our reality. You've given me so many great things. I give it back over to you. And in doing so, I give you laws that will help enshrine that for people, whether they realize it or not. So yes, we are all called to be part of politics, some of us less than others. But ultimately, by the fact that we are created by God, we all have an obligation to participate in politics. And that actually makes us more free, especially and most importantly, when our freedom is subjected to the truth, not imposed upon the truth. And that's the only way it works, with Christ at the center of it, his sacrifice, his love for us. As the readings today show, Isaiah showing us that the Messiah has to suffer, Hebrews showing us that what does life then look like because we've had a Messiah like this? And Jesus today giving us that answer, that all of us are called to serve, not to be served, and to give our life as a ransom for many.